Welcome back to Chess Dog. I'm John, and today we are visiting the St. Louis Rapid event that followed the St. Louis Championship recently, where Alireza Firouzja won the main classical tournament. This is a game from the Rapid tournament that he played against Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, who has really been on a tear himself recently. So you know, with players of this caliber, you're going to get some interesting chess. Firouzja has white, Mamedyarov has black. Let's jump right in. C4, the English opening from Firouzja, E5, G3, and bishop to E7. A bit of a strange move, but basically what Mamedyarov wants to do is play D6 and F5 and treat it like a classical Dutch opening. Knight C3, D6, D4, and F5. Now, white doesn't really get anything out of exchanging in the middle of the board. This doesn't do anything. Black is perfectly fine here. So instead, Alireza plays the move bishop to h3, an unorthodox move. More common, of course, is bishop to g2. But bishop to h3 is a very strong move and scores quite highly, immediately putting pressure on these light squares. Mamedyarov takes in the center, queen takes d4, now knight to c6, developing a piece and hitting the queen, which retreats back to d3. And now bishop to f6. The bishop is well placed, but white is better here. Black's pawn structure is strange. He's got weak light squares. His king is a little vulnerable. So black is not quite as well placed as white in this position. However, the best move for white here would have been knight to d5. But instead of that, Firouzja grabbed the pawn with bishop takes f5, and it turns out that was an imprecise move because of this response from Mamedyarov. Really kind of a shock, but bishop takes c3, check, giving up a well-placed bishop. Now, the bishop cannot be taken with the queen because then the bishop at f5 would just fall. So he has to take with the pawn, and here we see a really sickly queenside pawn structure from Firouzja, even though he is up a pawn at the moment. Knight to e5 attacks the queen and the pawn on c4, and really the square of c4 is probably more valuable than the pawn that's on it. So the queen moves to c2, and now Mamedyarov takes on f5, and after queen f5, queen to d7. You usually don't offer the exchange of queens when you're down a pawn, but black knows here that the long-term structural weaknesses aren't going anywhere, so that pawn will be recovered at some point. Queen takes queen, king takes d7, and right now black is aiming at that c4 pawn, so Firouzja just goes ahead and plays it to c5. He knows he can't save it, so you might as well, if you're going to give it up for something, and at the very least he can open up the d file and give black doubled pawns. So dc5, and now the material is equal, and both sides have big, clumpy pawn majorities, right? White has this on the king side, 4 versus 2. Black has 4 versus 2 on the queen side. So this is the essence of the play, trying to advance your own majority and stop your opponent's. Bishop to f4 hits the knight. The knight goes back to g6. Rook e8, keeping the knight in the middle of the board, was also a good option. Knight to g6, rook to d1 check, king to c6, and knight to f3. A strong idea. White doesn't mind if black takes the bishop, actually. He would just be removing a developed piece. In fact, after knight f4, knight to e5 check, an intermediate move, and after the king moves, pawn takes, and you can just compare the pieces, right? The knight is well developed, the rook at d1 is well developed, all of black's pieces are still on the back rank, and white's just clearly better. So instead of doing that, Mamedyarov plays rook to e8, gets the rook active, opposite white's king on e1, h4 threatening h5 to kick that knight on g6, but h5 is played in return. Now that prevents white from playing h5, but it creates a weakness on this g5 square that Firouzja immediately takes advantage of, threatening to go into f7, hitting the rook and causing all kinds of tactical problems for black. Knight to f6 is played. The knight is aiming at e4, so f3 keeps that knight out of e4 and also prepares white's own advance of e4. Knight to d5, attacking the c3 pawn and hitting the bishop on f4 twice, so white's move is really forced to retreat the bishop and defend the pawn. Knight to b6, aiming at the a4 square, which would attack c3. Also, the c4 square is strong. e4. So now Firouzja begins to advance his kingside and central majority. Knight to c4, king to e2, and b5. Mamedyarov does the same. Advances his queenside majority. Bishop to e1, Knight to b2 hits the rook moves up to d5, now knight goes to a4, again to put pressure on this c3 pawn. Bishop to d2, knight to e7, attacking white's rook on d5, the rook goes to e5, knight to c8. What Mamediyarov wants to do is to play the knight to d6. Maybe come in here, maybe put some pressure on e4. Rook to e6 check, better than just taking, because in this position, white ends up with better placed pieces. A knight to d6 blocks the check, but now rook to g6 attacks the g7 pawn. Rook to h6 offers the exchange of rooks, but he goes ahead and he takes the pawn on g7. And now knight to f5, taking advantage of the pin on the e file, and for the moment also attacking the rook at g7. So knight to h3 reveals the attack of the bishop on d1 to the rook on h6. So if black takes white's rook, white will take black's rook. The rook goes to f6, and now rook to g5. Aiming at this h5 pawn. White cannot take it yet because the knight would take on g3, and that would fork the king and the rook. But the pressure is still being applied to that pawn, and it's going to become an issue. b4. Mamediyarov advances his majority. Rook to c1, defending the c3 pawn. a5 keeps advancing. Knight to f4 is played, and remember, of course, still rook h5, knight g3 would fork. So knight to f4, adding another attacker to the h5 square. Pawn takes, bishop takes on c3, but now knight takes g3 check. Now, the knight can be taken, but it undermines the defense of the knight at f4. So rook takes g3, and now rook takes f4 is played. So black is aiming at this h4 pawn. So Firouzja plays bishop to e1, indirectly defending the pawn. If Mamediyarov were to take it, then rook to g6 check, unveiling the attack on the rook at h4, so he cannot do that. Instead, he plays the rook to f6, a much safer move. The rook goes back to g5, attacking the h5 pawn, doubling up on the f3 pawn. Rook to g3 to defend it. Rook to d6. Bishop takes a5. Now knight to b2. He could come in to d3 and even maybe settle in on f4 at some point. Rook to c2, knight to d3. Now bishop to d2 helps defend that square, so if the knight lands on it, white can take it, and that's exactly what happens. Mamediyarov plays knight to f4. Firouzja takes the knight. Rook takes f4, and here we have a pure rook endgame with white up one pawn. Rook to g5 attacks the pawn at h5, but allows black to take on h4. But, boom, rook takes c5, check. King b6, rook takes c7, rook to h1, and rook 7 c3, a consolidating move. And in this position, with black's king stuck on the A and B files and two extra pawns, Mamediyarov resigned, and Firouzja won this rapid game. Now, even going over this great game from Alireza Firouzja, there is still some great chess that you are missing out on. And to fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to check out is in this video right here. So make sure to watch that next, and you'll really see some mind-blowing chess.